I'm Dr. Pat Carnes, and I'm a senior fellow at the Meadows and the Meadows Institute. And we entitled this conversation we're about to have, A Gathering Storm. And I thought it appropriate to be on my porch. Last night we had a storm. Storms are usually ways that nature renews itself, but storms can be very destructive. Nature's very interesting if you look at it closely and you look out at woods. These trees, they're peaceful, tranquil. You walk amongst them, you feel very safe, close to nature. But in reality, when you look at a forest, there's a lot of competition going on for space, for air, for sun. And some win and some lose. And the whole way that occurs is that each is challenged to grow and fight for their survival. Look out at this lake out here. Surface is calm right now. Peaceful. Gives you a sense of renewal, to be near quiet water. Underneath the surface of that water, there's constant struggle. Bigger fish and animals, predatory on smaller ones, which are predatory on smaller ones. And that battle's going on all the time. So part of understanding physics, and I think part of Einstein's contribution to quantum physics, is the understanding that the world and the universe is filled with energy. Flows through even in the dark parts of space where there's no oxygen or even any hard formations. There's energy flowing. Huge amounts of energy. And they can cause an extraordinary amount of destruction. Systems collide. Planets are destroyed. So what I'm saying is that in ways, adversity is part of the universe. It's part of the design of the universe. Not sure why. We all speculate about what creation is all about. But I raise it as an issue because I think we're in a very unique situation this morning. It's August in 2020. I am 76 years old this summer, and I started in mental health on Labor Day weekend, which is next weekend, in 1970. It's 50 years ago. So I've been at this for 50 years. And I think when you're in your 70s, I've been reading a lot of people writing about their 70s, in which are very reflective about a lot of things. One is for sure, you know that the fuse is growing shorter. We all know that. You only have to have a few near catastrophe incidents in your own healthcare to realize that you are eventually going to die. And what that does is it ups the ante in terms of, in my particular case, being more truthful about what I really think. I think we all experience that. It also gives you the experience of trying to make meaning out of your life. You're closer to that. And I think what's going on in my life as I look back over the past 50 years is I see that we worked really hard at building this thing we call the mental health system. Because when I started in 1970, there wasn't much. There really wasn't much available. There were a lot of research going on. But the changes that have happened in the last 50 years have been spectacular. Now, right now, our whole world is caught up with a virus, climate change, tremendous political issues, economic issues, a lot of fear. And what I think that happens in change is just as in recent months here, there's about 6 trees, large trees, that aren't here now because of storms. I also have friends who are not here that were here last year because they died. And what it causes me to reflect on is that much of life is about letting go of things. And one of them is that our understandings start to shift. And I title this A Gathering Storm because I think on the horizon we have improved our understandings in mental health, and we look at the COVID crisis and we see the pandemic, but we don't see, but we have all the tools to see. There's a bigger problem coming. And we've known about it for a while. So what I want to do today is take a brief flashback back to the beginning, when I started my career, and what we knew then, and talk about, okay, so how did our perceptions change? I had to give up how I was trained, and there were things I was told that simply aren't true. Science has a way of bringing things to the surface, and the rapidity with which I've had to adjust to my understandings keeps going up. And I think that's the situation that we're in. And I think if we take seriously some of the learnings that we've accrued over the last 50 years, and we look behind all the things that are going on, we in mental health have got to stop and help the world to become aware, whatever happens with COVID, there's another reality, a bigger reality. And that reality is not just about how soon you get a vaccine or economic class issues. It's maybe about the survival of our species. Now that sounds dramatic, but I think not. I think it's a very serious time, and I'd like us to take kind of a sobering look at what we know to be true in our evolving knowledge. When I first started, one of the problems that we had is that addiction as a concept wasn't well understood. Criteria for understanding an addiction and what it was were not articulated. A lot of addictions weren't even acknowledged as addictive. So for example, in 1972, in talking to my own psychiatrist, I suggested to him the possibility existed that maybe sex could be an addiction. And he looked at me and he said, I know that's true. Well, we joined together. He found grants, my first grant, we got a couple grants, to research sex addiction, to start looking at it, start formulating it. And I wrote a manuscript that was circulated as an underground manuscript because it was pretty controversial in the 70s to talk about that kind of stuff. And then Orford came out with this article in the British Journal of Addictions about sex as an addiction, or what he called sexual dependency. And that encouraged me to take that manuscript and submit it, and eventually that became called Out of the Shadows. The irony in that story, as a footnote, is that psychiatrist, about 10 years later, had over 100 women come forward that he'd been sexual with in the office. Probably one of the best psychiatrists, therapists I'd ever seen work in my life. A colleague of Virginia Satir's, well respected. The controversy was huge. He lost his license. But more than that, he attacked me and saying that sex addiction didn't exist. And so from the very beginning, I was fighting for a concept he helped me develop. So even the issue of prejudices around the addictions that we did know existed. So for example, alcohol versus drugs. Alcohol patients, alcoholics, did not want to be put in the same group as drug addicts. And even professionals saw this, that they were different classes of people. And within the alcoholics, they would say that they had a problem, but the drug addicts were really sick people, and that they were somehow superior. And mixing the two together, now you have to remember, 1980, 1977, it was a big controversy. And along came Mary McCullough, in which she wrote that there really is a chemical dependency or a substance problem, and that all chemicals are affecting the brain in very similar or identical ways. We also, at that time, in the mental health side of the world, we thought of the personality disorders, mood disorders, as something you were born with. Hard to change. And that was a luck of the DNA draw. However, at the same time, early researchers were starting to parse that out. For example, within alcohol, MMPI studies is that there was like two groups, we called them primary and secondary alcoholics. Primary alcoholics started drinking at 13 or 14. Their McAndrews scale on an MMPI was much higher. The secondary alcoholics started drinking in their 20s and were alcoholics by the time they were in their 30s, and their McAndrews score was lesser. But what was important about it is not an alcoholic is an alcoholic is an alcoholic, is that there were differences between the groups, even though they both shared the problem of alcoholism. So our thinking was starting to shift. At the same time, we were starting to understand issues like trauma, sexual abuse, domestic violence. And they were denied or disputed. And I lived through the time where I heard people say sexual abuse is very rare and greatly exaggerated. That domestic violence really wasn't a problem, that people were overreacting. Whereas today, it's our number one unreported crime. It's the crime most committed in the United States and in Canada. So the fact is that we had a lot of work to do to explain and get the culture to understand. It's not okay to have sex with children. It's not okay to abuse physically family members. Trauma has a significant impact on things. I know for myself, I started working in the streets with kids in suburban area, affluent, and working with these kids, what I became aware of was they were doing a lot with drugs and alcohol. Their parents had no concept of what was happening with them. Something that actually parallels this time, and I'll come back to it. So we were in many ways unaware of adolescent use. That's the environment within which all of this study. One of the programs that started at that time, and this is one of the things that I feel very fortunate to work at the Meadows with my colleagues, the other senior fellows, is that in 1979 the Meadows started, and it had a different assumption. One is that there was more than just substance abuse, that there was eating disorders, sex addiction was an issue, compulsive gambling was an issue, and the fact is that all those people, when they were put in the same group, found extraordinary parallels, and then discovered that many of them had more than one issue together, and that addictions actually started reinforcing one another. The other things that the founders of the Meadows did, particularly P.M. Melody, the idea that you are not going to get sober from anything, you're not going to get any kind of progress in any addictive disorder unless you confront the trauma in your history. And that was the beginning of a thing we call Survivors Week. From the very beginning, the Meadows challenged the presuppositions that were widely held that that's a separate problem from addiction. And Meadows' model basically was saying, no, it's pretty basic to how it came all together. Now, so I want to point out that people were starting to talk, and a lot of pushback against that concept at the time. So the reality is that we've come a long way since then. But I remember my parents loved Frank Sinatra, and I watched the other night a documentary on Frank Sinatra's life and his friend Dean Martin. And Dean Martin had a shtick he did in Las Vegas, in which he had a drink in his hand, and he talked about his life, and he always referenced his drinking and how important it was and how it worked for him and what have you. So in the public eye, nicotine and alcohol were very accepted. And as we are finding now, both nicotine and alcohol can be extremely destructive to the body. But in that time, the resistance of the culture to understanding, now this becomes really important if you're going to get the punchline to this talk. We did not understand that nicotine and alcohol was self-destructive, could be very self-destructive. So my work at that time, I was trying to figure out how to explain how does an addiction work, let alone define what it is. And I've been trained in systems theory, and which is the soul of quantum physics. And systems theory is really great to look at addictions with, because an addiction is a recursive experience. All systems are recursive experiences. So we start off with the belief system. You have these beliefs that float around that you have in your brain about men, about women, who you are, what your value is, whether you deserve a place on the planet. All of those things floating out. They're beliefs that you got. But whether you're worthy. And out of that, those beliefs would affect your thinking. And one of the things that would occur would be impaired thinking. And then within that impaired thinking is how addictions would start. And there was an addiction cycle. And if you got yourself an addiction, one of the things that happened is what we call unmanageability, which is out of AA. They talked about how our lives had become unmanageable. And when somebody has an addiction, things fall apart. Within the addictive cycle, we said at the time, there was preoccupation. obsessional thinking. Now, we went on to show that in many different ways. Sex for sure had that, but take cocaine, for example. A cocaine addict, 1 year sober, out of treatment, can look at a picture of cocaine and in an fMRI, the brain will change as if it is using cocaine. In other words, that's when we learned that even thinking about the reward activates the reward center and actually helps us feel differently. It's a way to deal with pain, is to obsess about it. And then what we do is we do rituals that help the addiction get some kind of break down our defenses and start moving and acting out. And then we become compulsive in the behavior. Compulsivity always, going back to 1922. Now I want everybody to hear this. It's not a new word. Rado said in his classic book on drug addiction is, you know you have a drug addict when you have compulsive drug use. Now that's a little bit different than psychiatry uses the word compulsive, because they connect it up to obsessive compulsive behavior. And it's a little bit different within sex addiction, in which people see them as two different kinds of behavior, or that sexual compulsivity is really the problem and there's no such thing as sex addiction. The truth is, sexual compulsivity has been part of addiction in my writing since the beginning. So what happens with it, though, is that when you keep doing something you don't want to do, you start getting into despair and hopelessness. And that becomes an important part of our story as we go along. One of the ways out of it, if you're in that spot, is to start preoccupying again. So it's very systemic. There's these cycles of processes that go on within the brain, and that creates the unmanageability, that creates what we call an addiction. That's what I was thinking then. And then what I did, there also was, we addressed the issue that despair was buried in shame and guilt for things that you had done. That has to be also addressed. I realized something that was, it's one thing to be able to name something and even describe it. But one of the questions we had is, what were the component parts of it? And also, what does that mean for treatment? So the chart, The Making of a Sex Addict, summarizes all that we knew in 1990, 1991 about sex addiction. We knew the kind of families they came from. We knew the abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, and emotional abuse rates. We knew how they were traumatized. We knew that there were stressors that caused usually the onset. We had 10 criteria for sex addiction that we validated. And then we started breaking down the sexual behavior, because there were different kind of families of behaviors that sex addicts would do, and that they were very related also to other addictions, and those addictions interacted. That sheet, that's everything I knew at the time. And we would teach that. And I had worked 20 years to get to the point, to make that very chart you're looking at right now. However, it never survived the 90s. And how do I know that? I had a patient, minister, and was sent to treatment because on July 4th, he started looking at pornography. He had modest savings, $25,000, and he started spending it on the pornography. And by the middle of August, he was stealing church funds to support his habit. I mean, we're talking 2 months. And he looked at me and he said, "It happened so fast. couldn't believe how fast it happened. Now, I think about that today. And the problem that I was having as I listened to him is all the things in my carefully researched chart about where describing how well somebody became a sex addict. He didn't have trauma in his background. He didn't have come from the family system that I thought it came from. He didn't do it the same way as the other addicts that I've seen. And the difference was digitalized media changed the whole picture. And it's changed the whole picture for all of us. So what I've had to do now is to realize and modify over time. I put so much time and effort, a decade's worth of research, following 1,000 people for 7 years to get those figures. And today there are people who fit that model, but not many, because it has changed. So how did it all occur? Well, the reality is that I believe in the 80s, there was a number of pivotal events. You'll be all interested to know, because the big issue that you often hear is sex addiction is not in the DSM. Well, in 1988 it was. The DSM-3R listed sexual addiction 302.89. And what happened was that the women's movement just started challenging the American Psychiatric Association about the DSM, including sex addiction, because they saw sex addiction as a way to get people off the hook for their sexual behavior. And then a woman by the name of Judith Herman wrote a paper about why the women's movement needed to support the understanding of sex addiction and why every woman has a stake in this concept. That quieted down, but sex addiction didn't go back in when it quieted down. The other interesting thing is at that time, for the first time in the history of the DSM, cocaine was accepted as an addiction. In other words, you have to understand cocaine has long been known to be addictive. But the time between when you discover something and when it appears in the DSM is an evolving document and always has been. The other thing that was going on is that our understanding of trauma really started to shift and what it did to the brain. And we were starting to have ways of looking at the brain that saw those shifts. And so one of the papers that really changed things was written by a colleague of mine, also a senior fellow at the Meadows, Bessel van der Kolk, and probably one of the most important papers out of the 20th century. And he talked about the neurobiology of traumatic bonding, where you would attach to people who were dangerous to you, and what happened in the brain to be able to affect the decision making of how the brain made choices. And I'll show you some of the evidence for that. Also, at that time, Don't Call It Love was out. And so we were working with the understanding that in that chart I showed you summarized all that research. And then finally, people like Alan Shore, and and there are many, many others. And I know I'm making it. I don't want to be of disservice to the many people who worked in attachment theory, but Alan Shore really started talking about those early years in a more sophisticated way of what attachment really did to people and how that affected everything. That was pivotal, and things started picking up speed then. And one of the things that happened is that We, in the 90s, started using fMRIs and started asking questions about multiple addictions. And by the early 2000s, people were seeing that what happened in gambling affected the same parts of the brain as cocaine would or other substances, and that we started to see that they were parallel. And they were starting to notice that the same structures of DNA and genetic research, that dopamine seemed to be one of the culprits of it, but that the DNA was different for addicts. And so anyway, the neurobiological part of the brain started to become an important part of the process. In 2005, the Royal Academy had Dr. Nestler give a speech in what he called the natural addictions as being one of the most important things for us to start to acknowledge. About 3 years later, a paper appeared called A Unified Framework for Addiction. And it was done by a man named Reddish, who did a 94-page meta review in a medical journal that was just one of the outstanding understandings of the many ways that the brain, and what basically he was saying, there are 10 different portals by which the brain becomes addicted to things. They're just not just one of them. And there are 7 theories of what made the brain so vulnerable, but that all 7 theories counted. And it was a major revolution and amassed a tremendous amount of data that, in fact, it was real. And I've outlined for you some of the work that Reddish and his colleagues did, and I'm not wanting you to even understand it. I'm just showing you the complexity and the review of the literature. I guess I'm doing that because I was really tired, I am tired still, when I hear people stand up and say there is no proof that addiction, let alone sex addiction, exists. And when in fact there's been a lot of science that's gone into this. And Reddish opened it so that people would, like the American Society on Addiction Medicine, really started to acknowledge, and we now had a professional medical society dedicated to becoming an addictionologist. In other words, that it was a specialty. And that was a big shift. And one of the things it says is, at its core, addiction isn't just a social problem or a moral problem. It wasn't about character or criminality. It's a brain problem. And it manifests in all kinds of areas. And one of the things is that the reward circuitry for both sex and food fit the criteria, and one of the reasons those addictions are so hard is because we're wired for survival. You can give up alcohol, you can't give up eating. You don't give up your sexuality. So the fact is that these are really tough addictions. So what today, we are sitting with 30% of our children obese and 30% of our adults obese. And that the large number of food programs out there to lose the weight and then you put it back on and move to the next food program, it's like people are struggling with this. The cost to the medical care system is huge. And so the fact is that the natural addictions, if you will, really was being acknowledged by the addiction community as a very real reality. Something I want to point out to you in this paper that I'm putting in front of you at this point in time, called The Genetic Basis of Addictive Behavior, is a great summary of the emerging model that now helps us to make sense of the whole deal. The brain is really a platform for what? Energy. Energy, electrochemical energy flows through the brain. And so in her book, Never Enough, Judith Grisel talks about how the whole brain is involved in the process. In fact, this has been a proven point for a long time. I'll tell you a little kind of a weird story, but back in 1937, in early brain research, a researcher took his wife's curling iron and burned off all the parts of the brain that had any kind of connection with memory. And the addicted rat, when put back in the cage, went straight to the addictive pellets, did the maze, got to it, but wasn't supposed to have any memory. And the reason for that, an early discovery, is that our brain is hooked up at a molecular level. Every cell has, it's like a tree, has rings that tell you what's happened in the season. The fact is that any trauma that happens to the body is recorded. And any cell can hook on that internet that goes on in the brain, which is directed by little tuning forks we call genes that send messages to the body and to the brain about how things are supposed to happen. So in our brain, there isn't a piece that we can pull out and say, this is the self or this is an addiction. It's throughout the whole brain. So some of you are familiar with the idea that futurists talk about, that there's so many innovations in medicine, that cancer and heart disease and what have you, that our longevity is going to be increased, which is true, but you're going to see that actually it's decreasing, which is part of the crisis. The one exception that they talk about is addiction, because it involves the whole brain. There's no, it's a total involvement. So we haven't got a mechanism or a pill or a surgery that fixes addiction. What happens is that when a trauma occurs, this electrochemical soup, that's who we are in there, makes sense of that and tries to up the ante through reward, what have you, to feel better. My friend Matar Gabor says that, he says, you know, all addiction starts with a person trying to solve a problem. They were trying to solve a problem. So a 13-year-old girl discovers alcohol. She has DNA that means that her dopamine receptors don't work as well as others do. And she wants to feel better. She notices that her friends are more comfortable, more lively, more attractive, more vivacious. She wants to be like them. And she takes her first taste of alcohol. Most kids tasting alcohol, yuck. She takes her first taste of alcohol, and suddenly those feelings go away. Solves a problem. And what the authors of this paper, Ducci and Goldman, talk about is it goes from that solving a problem and starts to become impulsive. And impulsivity is the beginning of an addictive pattern. And then you start to repeat it. You repeat it enough so the reward system starts to alter and you create more problems for yourself. It eventually becomes compulsive. So it goes impulsive and then compulsive. And then compulsivity moves into addiction. This becomes very important if you're going to get what I say at the end. And there's biomarkers. This is what some people really miss, is the difference between compulsivity and addiction. We know what goes into that. And one of the signs of that is they do things that they know are going to hurt them, and yet they do them anyway. This is critical. There's also withdrawal.
Now people say there's no withdrawal in sex addiction. Not true. In my patients, sex addict it's just like cocaine. Takes a person who's in the advanced stages of his addiction about 21 days of non-acting out for his brain to simmer down enough to start getting therapeutic traction. And we've charted those days. The hardest day is day 11. Between 11 and 14, they come into treatment. Now, it's not like alcohol where the first 3 days of withdrawal is, a great detoxing process. It's different, more like cocaine or crystal meth. And interestingly enough, sometimes that person has both for a lot of reasons. What Ducci and Goldman are saying is that we have these biomarkers, and what you're having is an addiction, is a medical condition now, because there has been created a set point, or sometimes the language is used as a default position of algorithms, neural algorithms, that will always be there. That's important to understand, that they'll always be there. So there is a way of fixing that. But let's back up for a minute. If you were pre-diabetic, or you were a diabetic, and your doctor says to you, you're going to have to use insulin in order to stay alive, no problem. You do it. In mental health, people don't take it quite so seriously. So let's take bipolar, for example. Bipolar is a real brain problem. We have really good ways and methodologies and prescriptive medicine that can help a bipolar resolve the brain issues and live a more balanced, even life. In fact, you can, just like that diabetic, you can have a full life and enjoy it as long as you stay on your medications. However, what happens in bipolar, it happens to a lot of it, is you start feeling better and you don't feel like you have to take your pills anymore. They are famous for going off their medications and going off the rails. I have a colleague that's a psychiatrist, and she held up and looked at me one day at lunch, and she's bipolar, and she's got her medication. She said, I hate taking these, but the fact is, without them, I don't function well. And I kid myself to thinking I can handle it. I think that happens to lots of people in mental health, that they don't take seriously the successes that psychiatry is having at helping ways to support the brain into getting into a better position, because they haven't accepted that they have a medical condition. And addiction is a medical condition. And there are things that you have to do in order to be able to be sober, or to get into a place where you are, in fact, doing better. What Ducci and Goldman say is that this encompasses drugs, food, sex, video gaming, very important. Gambling costs alone is $484 billion. They could not help but notice that just the substance abuses knocking almost $500 billion a year out of our medical system. This is not including obesity. This is not including what happens in sex addiction, which is huge. For example, today, throat cancer used to be something you got at age 54, and it was because of tobacco or alcohol. Today, the age of onset of throat cancer is 32, and it's because of HPV contracted with unprotected sex with your sex buddy in the 7th grade. I want you to hear that. We have medical costs that are going up. HIV is not gone. It still costs us lots of money. And the fact is that if you start adding them all together, you're talking trillions. Now, you compare that what we spend on diabetes, $131 billion a year. Cancer, we only spend $170 billion a year. And it's the really critical thing to understand about all of this, to get nothing else out of this, is the thing that made it different is trauma or toxic stress, which the brain started with enzymes and hormones that started to alter the DNA of the patient. Now, back to my minister. What happened, I believe, is that there are people who are predisposed. And addiction, it's usually, in each addiction, it's about between 23 and 25% have a lot of that disease in their history. The DNA is parallel, but doesn't guarantee they're going to get it, but cancer or anything. But there is a predisposition. In studies that we have been doing on this very issue, we now know that in dopamine being an example, and I'm going to talk more about that, but the fact is, in patients when we tested them, 100% had a dopamine problem. How did it go from 23% to 100%? The answer is trauma. Trauma changes everything. And so the reality is that today, if you're dealing with addiction, you got to be able to also deal with mechanisms of trauma, and also you have to have access to thinking about what's happening in the brain. Another thing that happened that changed things for us, and it's very important because it's part of the solution. It's a guy by the name of Jacinto Mihaly. It took me 6 months to learn how to say his name. Wrote a book called Flow. Flow issued a challenge to addiction medicine that really still hasn't been heard in all corners. What he said is he was studying what made people happy. And what made people happy, he's starting in 1947. In war-torn Europe, he was trying to figure out what made people happy. And he came to the conclusion with 180 studies across the world that people of great achievement, people who experienced real happiness, were people who were doing something they were good at, that they enjoyed, had challenge, and made them happy. That happiness was contingent on being involved in a meaningful activity that mattered to them, and that they also had that's something that was built into that about challenge. And what he said then to the addiction community is this. He said, getting sober, to use that kind of language, getting into a balanced life, it's easy to get sober. Many people have done that many times in their lives. Staying in the balance is what's tough. That requires more. And the critical element in that is to understand that addiction is, if you aren't challenged, if the brain is not challenged, if you're not engaged in something that matters. Think of these trees, think of that lake out there, about how nature is organized around challenge, including human beings. And if you do not have a meaningful challenge, you're going to start, because addiction is a challenge. You know, I look at my patients, they say, were you a good addict? And they all smile and say, yeah, I was good. Were you able to persevere? Were you a great problem solver? All of those things were true in their addiction. They can still be true in a recovery life. So Flow was a very important book, and one of the things he said, almost any activity can become addictive in the sense that instead of being a conscious choice, it becomes a necessity that interferes with other activities. You become captive to a certain kind of order. And he used this model what he called the flow channel, where you had either too much stress or none, and that you had to have your channel, and we built on that. So one of the things that we did is we started talking about a recovery zone in which you lived in that middle channel, and what occurred is that when you were overwhelmed, overstressed, what have you, and when you were doing things you hated doing and you were bored to death. You had to find the right things that were your call, that fit your abilities, that made you happy. And so Recovery Zone, the book, was born, and we've been working hard. And Recovery Zone 2 is about to come out, be out next April. And what that takes and helps a patient do is to translate what they know they need to do. It's not just a head thing, but to translate it into their everyday life. The important part about all this is to understand what happens to the brain. There are all kinds of different examples we can use, and I just selected a few. But there's a bottom line message. This is a brain that looks healthy. You'll notice the surface of the brain. These are SPECT scans, courtesy of Dan Ammann, who I highly respect and has taken lots of flack about it. But you know what? He's done so much good in helping the public become good consumers of health information about the brain. This is a brain of a sex addict. You'll notice there's parts of it that's not being used. So for what we've learned from fMRI studies, our colleagues in Europe determined 4 hours of porn a week. What happens in the brain is that it starts to restructure itself and actually cannibalize itself. So gray matter declines, and the striatum, where you have memory, you have your conscience, you have your emotional regulation, all that gets affected. Your frontal lobes are affected. And so what happens then is that there's parts of the brain that become inactive, and you can see that. So this is another brain of a sex addict, and this is a before, patient A before, and then there's 2 years of recovery. Notice the difference. I'll tell you one thing I have learned in all this. We have a brain lab with every one of our programs at the Meadows. And when we want to get a scan like this, we think that it's important for a patient to go out and get your brain scanned. I believe that part of our practice eventually will be that Ammann says, and it's true, we are the only group in medicine who doesn't systematically look at the organ they're treating. And I'll tell you, when your patient sees that there's parts of his brain that is no longer functional, it's like you got to take your insulin. So the fact of the matter here is you have to start knowing your brain. And one of the things that ASAM says is that it's a primary chronic disease of brain reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. And that it makes both food and sex into something where there's never enough. Now, let's step back for a moment. Dopamine. You know about dopamine. It raises your, when you eat a good meal, your dopamine goes up about 50%. Alcohol raises it about 100%. Cocaine raises it at about 200 or 300%. Nicotine, 200%. Alcohol, 100%. But amphetamines raise it 1,100%. Here's why that's really, really important. You cannot be a recreational user of crystal meth because it rewires your brain so fast. And one of the things that I believe also is true, for some people, there is what we call the supernormal stimulus, and you can find it in chemicals with crystal meth. In sex addiction, you can find that in porn. Because what happens is we were built, we evolved to be able to work on a relationship and it becomes sexual, what have you, and it's kind of a one-on-one experience. The stimulation is, and I believe that. I mean, I've been married, I've been divorced, I had a long-term marriage, 20 years. My wife died, and now I am remarried to another widow. And both of us feel that we are, each death, each loss, we are much better spouses today than we were ever to our previous spouses. And the point of it is this, is that to really show up in a marriage or in a relationship requires your total attention. What happens on the internet is you can be involved with 5, 6 people at once. You can look at 50 naked men or women at once. It's affecting our kids dramatically. It's affecting men and women. And our sexuality is changing as a result. Where it's going, I'm not sure. But it is changing things. And this is another example. This is a picture of midbrain, and that's lit up yellow. And you have a normal person, an obese person, and you have a cocaine user and an alcoholic, and you see the red is not there, which means the dopamine is not getting there, so it doesn't light up. What that indicates is that this whole process, this genetic process and the dopamine part is just part of it. And, but that the accelerators are access. One thing is computer, you have access. In school, you have access to drugs, toxic stress, hormonal interaction, supernormal stimulus. We wrote an article some time ago that we were hypothesizing that we'd be able to predict, and we are working on this right now, is looking at the DNA of sex addiction and looking also that it's connected, just like obesity and in alcohol, there are different types that evidence for polymorphic associations with specific clustering of sexual typologies. And not all sex addicts are alike, I guess is what I'm saying. Not all people who are obese are alike in terms of it. But the concept of dopamine insufficiency is one of the common themes, so that the process of dopamine is impaired. Attention deficit disorder goes with this. Addictions interact as a result. And also, the interesting thing is that the mental health issues, personality disorders, when the addictions are formed, the mental health disorders also start to appear. In other words, you don't have to be born with a mental health problem. It can evolve as a result of trauma. And I'll give you some examples of that as we go along. So one of our results, for example, in addition to looking at the dopamine issues, we're seeing this in looking at both patients, case examples, as well as students who tested out also as positive for sex addiction, had attention deficit disorder. And that if you had sex addiction, you were likely to be twice as likely to have ADHD, for example. So this cartoon struck me because the fact is that the digitalized world presents many, many challenges, and it's changing everything. And there's an experiment that created quite a controversy not long ago, because it's really very true, I think. Children and teenagers aged between 12 to 18 voluntarily spent 8 hours alone without access to any means of communication, mobile phones, the internet, what have you. Only 3 of the 68 participants reached the end of the experience, 1 girl and 2 boys. When I speak to audiences, I especially love to do this to doctors. And my challenge is that to not look at your phone once during the entire talk. And I would like to ask you at this point in time, have you been looking at your phone since we started? I bet you have. And so the fact is that what was happening to kids is that the digitalization is moving very fast, and it's a very important concept because Edward Wilson talks about this. We remain a biological species in a biological world, wondrously well adapted to the conditions that we evolved with in our Earth's former environment. But in body and soul, we are children of the Holocene, the epoch that created us, but yeah, we're far from well adapted to its successor, the Anthropocene. Things are moving faster, and it's creating changes. There are kids, I mean, I had my 4-year-old the other day fix my iPhone. There are parts of their brain that we're seeing that we don't have. So one of the things that is an open question right now is if we will see evolution within a single generation. And it changes everything. So the fact is, these kinds of pictures of a couple who aren't talking, just married, another one of them's talking and they're on the phone. And this is what happens when a sex addict is exposed to digital stimuli, the same reactions that they see with other addictions. One of the, not only is the brain change, but one of the things that we also see is that there are unexpected consequences. One is impotency and the inability to sexually function. And what happens is if you are sexually stimulated by so many participants, when it comes to a meaningful relationship and being able to do sexual expression within that context, it's not stimulating enough. And so that's a real problem for many people who have been doing porn, for example. The good news is that the ICD-11 now has sexual compulsivity in it. And even though it's under sexual compulsivity as a designation, that's exactly the same route that happened with gambling. And then gambling slid over into the DSM-5 as a behavioral addiction. And that's what will happen with sex addiction, we believe. I know that for myself, I spent a lot of time, this article of mine appeared in the Journal of Addiction Medicine. I looked at the criteria for diagnostic criteria, and then I contrasted to 2 other studies that have been done. For those people who don't believe there's a literature, there's a vast literature, and this is a selected bunch of them. And you'll notice in almost every category, there's a lot of common agreement about the diagnostic criteria. I want to raise this as an issue too. I think there's some assumptions for this next part of the discussion. And that is that alcohol is not that bad for you, or that it can be tolerable. And I had the recent example of working with various airlines, trying to helping pilots. And pilots are a very interesting group of people. With pilots, what we have is that they're very good at what they call literally the ability to tunnel and focus. They're very creative, smart, and but sometimes so smart they overlook the obvious. And they are really a rare breed and very used to controlling their circumstances. And in treatment, very hard group as a group, to be in a rehab situation because they struggle with authority figures. I'm always interested in history, and of all the aces, for example, in the Battle of Britain, every ace had a employment record with the military of having authority issues. And one of the things that happened, they were the people who had the wide-ranging minds, thought outside of the box, and were able to be successful at bringing the enemy down on both the German and the British side. But what was interesting to me as I was doing the research is that, you know what? There's a paper NASA put out in 2007, and in that paper, one of the things that they talked about led me to a series of experiments that were done. In the pilot's mind, they have to pass a blood test in order that there's no alcohol in it. So it's just like a driver, And if you have a certain level of alcohol in your bloodstream, you are declared legally impaired. And you will get a DUI or DWI, whatever you want to call it in your state. But there is a set, whether it be wine or alcohol, various kinds of alcohol, there's a formula for that. But that alcohol is out of your blood in 11 hours. So what pilots think is, if I'm at a party, I get drunk, I use that level and become impaired. If I sleep on it and 11 hours are over, I can pass my test, not a problem. However, what happens is that in simulators, these same pilots who would consume that alcohol would make mistakes in the simulators, like landing on another airplane on the runway, up to 39 hours later from the drinking experience. In other words, not 11 hours, 39 hours. So what they would grab the wrong instrument or make the wrong move. And so the point I'm making is this, is that the brain is affected much longer and not detected. They still make mistakes. I found that fascinating because people think of alcohol as a short-lived experiment. Reason I'm bringing it up is a new book I highly recommend. It raises lots of issues about these times. Malcolm Gladwell is one of the most provocative and good writers of scientific journalism that we have. He wrote The Outliers, for example, which is an excellent book. His new book, Talking to Strangers. It's a fine book. Basically, what he's trying to explain is why white cops would be shooting black people and what the assumptions are between the arresting officer about the person that they shoot. And it has a lot to do about certain assumptions that they make about that person. As part of that research, he made a discovery. As you all know, there has been across this country story after story of sexual assaults that occur on our college and university campuses like never before, that have evolved in the last decade. Sexual assault has accelerated dramatically. Is it a matter of reporting? Well, I'm sure that's part of it. But what Gladwell says is the problem is that when kids go to parties, they're drinking differently. Now, I'm saying to you, kids are growing up differently and they start using alcohol and drugs much earlier. But what's happening is by the time they go to the party, it's not to get drunk at the party, they're already drunk. So all the alcohol they consume at the party adds to that. And they go into a thing we call blackout. And blackout means that you do things, even though you seem okay and you can talk, have conversations or what have you, you have no memory of what you did. And basically what they call that is myopia. And the problem with myopia is that you have no sense in the blackout of what you're doing as hurtful or having consequences. This is the extreme point of all addictions if you've hit the point of myopia. So what happens? Party, drink before, the girl is drunk in a blackout, he is drunk in a blackout, he sexually assaults her. She wakes up in the hospital as a rape victim. Neither one of them has a memory of it. She can't tell him how it happened. She can't remember the guy. She barely remembers she was going to a party. She has no idea. He has no idea that he did anything. So he uses an example of a case in which he fully develops this out. You know, a very upper class school, brilliant student, high grades, high performing athlete, critical to the teams that he belongs to. Anybody's ideal student. Rapes this woman, this young woman, and what happens is a couple of, I think, Norwegian grad students see him grab her and get on top of her and start assaulting her and hurt her, and they go and they grab him and pull him off her, sit on him while they call the police and get her some help. She wakes up, she knows she's been hurt in the hospital, and the nurses explain very tenderly, you've been raped, but they caught the boy who did it, and she had no memory of the event. He had no memory of the event. Now, can you prosecute somebody who is not remembering where they were or what they were doing? No, yes, you can. We can't get away with that. If a driver under the influence hits a car and is responsible for a death, they are liable for that. In other words, being an addict is no excuse if you break the law. It's part of the consequences. So he was successfully prosecuted because in this case, there were witnesses to the rape. But to both of them, and it changed their lives, obviously, radically, both of them. He was in prison for her getting over the rape, like any woman who's raped. It takes a while to do that. So the point I'm making is that, first of all, is that drinking heavily 50 years ago pales in comparison to the drinking young adults of our college ages. Women now equal and at times exceed men in their use of alcohol. Blackouts that were once rare are now common. Of college drinkers, over half have had a blackout. That's half of our college drinkers. 40% in the last year, 10% within the last 2 weeks. Myopia is a major factor in the dramatic increase of sexual assaults on campus. What Gladwell says about myopia is this. The lesson of myopia is really very simple. If you want people to be themselves in a social encounter with a stranger, to represent their own desires honestly and clearly, they cannot be blind drunk. And if they are blind drunk and therefore at the mercy of their environment, the worst possible place to be is in an environment where men and women are grinding on the dance floor and jumping on the tables. A Kappa Alpha fraternity party is not a Kanban drinking circle. I'm raising it because what I'm saying about alcohol is a very hard drug. It's a hard drug. And our culture has lost sight of that. There are many things I could point to that we have learned that have these characteristics, like, for example, financial risk-taking, hedge funds, what have you. Just basically like pathological gambling. And Stanford did a study of high-risk money managers, of which there have been many that have ran afoul of the law. And financial risk-taking has the same characteristics and the same parts of the brain that get affected by it. All that I'm trying to say is that there's so many ways that addiction plays into our life. I could do a whole thing just in the ways that finances and the use of money become part of the problem. Want to bring this to your attention about why I think it's important. First of all, in front of you is what is called Pervitin. It was invented in Germany in 1930. The Germans were great chemists. Now you have to remember what kind of state Germany was in 1930. They had lost World War I and were paying reparations they could ill afford. They were punitive. And with it came the assumption that they started the war, which they felt they didn't, nor did they feel that they lost the war. They just agreed that it's time to stop killing each other. That's all it was to them. It wasn't like a loss, so nobody was making any progress. So the problem is they felt cheated and they felt depressed. The whole nation was depressed. When Bayer invented aspirin, the same week he invented cocaine. I mean, that's the track the Germans were on. And German chemists came up with a chemical that today we call crystal meth. They called it Pervitin. You could get it in any drugstore. And what happens with Pervitin is that crystal meth, first of all, immediately takes away feelings of depression. So immediately you feel better. And so you didn't need a prescription. Anybody could buy it. In fact, they made quite a packaging and marketing effort. There were whole special Pervitin packages for housewives so they could work harder. Because on Pervitin, you had a great deal of energy. Didn't need to sleep. You felt creative. You felt empowered by the drug. By the late 30s, most Germans were using Pervitin regularly. Hitler himself had Pervitin and cocaine injected into his veins along with vitamins. 1936, his physician did that daily. By 1939, people who are writing the medical history of Germany, their guess that he was probably pretty psychotic by 1939. And that what was happening by the early 40s, doctors started to notice psychoses and withdrawal symptoms all across Germany. And they tried to put it on a prescription list. Too late. Germans were used to using it, and the military was used to using it. The reason that the Germans could walk over the British and the French in World War II was all their soldiers were high. They were given these tabs. You didn't have the risk of falling asleep on a watch, and they could drive on through. They were stronger, more motivated. Their equipment wasn't as good, and it was like 3-to-1 French and British soldiers over the Germans, and they walked right all over them. Why? Because they were high. Guderian and Rommel, the two generals that led that attack, Hitler told them to stop, and they said, heck no, we're having too much fun. And they headed all the way to the beaches of Normandy, and they conquered France. And that's where Blitzkrieg was really born. You had a nation that was on drugs. Now, why is that important? Because, first of all, one of the things that crystal meth does is it literally nullifies that part of the brain that contains mirror neurons, which is the part of our brain which builds relationship and has compassion. It's what allows us to work with other people. And that was extinguished, which is why the Germans who were over the centuries took pride in their ethics, their honor, and acting honorably. that they could sit next to and live next to a concentration camp and know what was going on in there and not care. And we had no idea that was going on. It wasn't until there was a British Me-109, a fighter plane crashed into Britain, a survivor kit was discovered, and it had Pervitin in it, that the British became aware that the German pilots were on drugs, and that's what made them so formidable. Reason I bring it up is the lack of compassion is really important, because in this country, our measures of empathy have shown a steady decline of empathy in general population for the last 20 years. And the common thing that I hear is, why can't our Congress get together? Why can't we work things out? Why can't we come up with compromises? Why can't we partner? The answer is that we have lost our compassion. And I'm saying to you, we have addiction in so many forms that are affecting our ability to work together as a culture. It's becoming scary. And we have huge challenges ahead.